A police cruiser screeched to a halt in front of the Bennett home, doors flung open, guns holstered but hands twitching. An 8-year-old girl peeked from behind her father as uniformed strangers demanded to speak with her, not him. Yesterday, she gave away her peanut butter sandwich. Today, officers spoke her name like it was evidence. Michael Bennett's heart pounded with the rhythm of fear only a father knows. They hadn't said she was in trouble, not exactly. But they weren't smiling. And the worst part? They already knew about the sandwich. Something was very, very wrong. And before the sun would rise again over Springfield Heights, that simple act of kindness would unravel secrets buried for decades. But before we begin, write in the comments where you're from. I'm curious to see how far these stories can travel. And of course, subscribe so you don't miss new captivating tales. Let's begin. The morning had started like any other in the quiet cul-de-sac of Willow Ridge Lane, where front lawns were clipped like military haircuts and mailboxes never dared to lean sideways. 8-year-old Emily Bennett had her backpack zipped, her shoes double-knotted, and a peanut butter sandwich tucked carefully into the pocket of her lunchbox, the way her mother always did, with crusts off and a tiny smiley face drawn in jelly. Michael Bennett, a former Marine turned HVAC technician, was sipping coffee by the window when the squad car rolled up like a steel ghost. He'd seen enough in his life to know, when two cops arrive without lights or sirens, they aren't here for show, they're here for something they can't say over the phone. The officers introduced themselves like people who already knew too much. Mendoza, stocky, calm, with the quiet posture of a man used to delivering hard truths, and Jameson, younger, twitchier, eyes scanning the living room like it might suddenly combust. Michael's instinct was to shield his daughter, but Officer Mendoza crouched down, not with menace, but with something heavier. He asked Emily about the man near Willow Creek Park. The one with the beard. The one who sat on a green bench under the crooked oak. The one she'd smiled at and fed her sandwich to. When Emily nodded, Mendoza exchanged a look with his partner. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. Sarah Bennett, who had been folding laundry in the next room, emerged when she heard her daughter's voice start to quiver. Her eyes caught Michael's. Those two had a language that didn't need words. He gave her the look that meant, stay calm, don't panic, but brace yourself. The officers never used the word danger. They never mentioned threats. They simply asked the same question 3 times, did he say anything to you? Did he ask you for anything? Did he tell you where he was going? And when they left, offering a number and a warning to call if anything felt off, Michael shut the door slowly, like it was the last barrier between them and something he didn't yet understand. That night, Emily had trouble sleeping. Kids don't forget when grown-ups act scared. Michael and Sarah spoke in the kitchen, whispers sharp as needles. Sarah insisted on walking her to school the next morning. She needed to see the man for herself. The next day, the weather broke. Gray clouds huddled overhead, and the air smelled like it might cry. Sarah held Emily's hand tighter than usual. When they reached Willow Creek Park, the bench sat empty. No sleeping bag. No backpack. No man. He was always here, Emily said quietly. He said this bench was his thinking place. Sarah looked around, heart thudding like a church bell. They made one slow lap around the park before heading back. But then she saw him. Not in the park. Not by the bus stop. Not where he belonged. He was standing across from their house, half hidden behind a utility box, eyes darting like a hunted animal. When Sarah's gaze met his, he flinched. Then he bolted like a deer hearing the crack of a rifle. That night, Michael went looking. He found him near the creek under the highway overpass, hunched over, face pale and swelling, eyes bulging with something more than fear. The man tried to run again, but Michael's voice cracked through the cold, Frank. Stop. Please. I'm not here to hurt you. Frank froze. At the sound of Emily's name, spoken gently, with the tenderness only a father could summon, Frank turned. His lips trembled. His face was blotched. He looked like death had tapped him on the shoulder and he hadn't yet answered. "I didn't mean to scare her," Frank muttered. "I didn't mean to scare anyone. I didn't know there were peanuts in the sandwich." Michael blinked. "You had a reaction?" Frank nodded slowly, voice hoarse. "Went to St. Mary's. Checked myself out. Couldn't pay. I've seen what happens to folks who owe hospitals." Michael sat down on the wet stone beside him. "You almost died." Frank stared ahead. "Wouldn't be the first time." Back home, Sarah was on the phone. She'd called St. Mary's. Confirmed everything. Frank had given a fake name and fled before they could stabilize him. But here's where the story twisted like barbed wire. The police weren't looking for Frank because he'd done something wrong. They were trying to help him. The Hope Care Outreach Initiative, barely a month old, had flagged Frank's case. Springfield Heights had quietly rolled out a pilot program, anonymous medical aid, job placement, transitional housing for the homeless. But they needed his signature. And Frank. Frank had vanished. The sandwich, the police, the fear, none of it was about a crime. It was about a second chance that almost disappeared. Michael and Sarah didn't sleep much that night. They wrote down everything Frank might need. The next day, Michael found him again, this time with a printed form and a hot coffee. Frank cried. Not like a man, but like a child who'd just been told he mattered. He took the form. Signed it with shaking hands. And just like that, a homeless man became a patient. A patient became a tenant. A tenant became a friend. And over time, a friend became something more. To Emily, he was Uncle Frank now. He made her birdhouses. Picked her up from school. He clapped the loudest at her piano recital. But somewhere in the quiet of that joyful spring, something still didn't sit right with Michael. Something Mendoza had said. Something he hadn't said. And the truth about Frank's past. That was still hidden, just beneath the surface. Waiting. It started with a creak, soft, sharp, and wrong. Michael Bennett had always trusted his instincts. They'd saved his skin in Iraq and kept his family safe when the world around them turned jagged. That night, a strange sound from the hallway sent a ripple of unease through his chest, not because it was loud, but because it didn't belong. He got up quietly, stepped barefoot through the living room, and found the front door slightly ajar. That's when the cold hit him, not the kind that nips at your fingers in winter, but the kind that wraps around your spine and whispers, "You missed something." Nothing appeared stolen. Nothing broken. But on the doormat, neatly folded and left like an offering, was a manila envelope without a name. Michael carried it inside like it might explode. He opened it with a knife, slow and deliberate, as Sarah watched from the kitchen doorway, eyes wide and full of dread. Inside were documents, photocopies of old case files, faded hospital records, a grainy black and white photo of a man lying on a gurney. Blood on his chest. Eyes open. The name on the chart, Franklin Harrow. But the date? The date said the man was dead. Dead, not weeks ago. Not months ago. Dead 5 years ago. Michael didn't say a word for a long time. Just stared at the photo, as if willing it to be false. But the handwriting was real. The red-stamped word deceased was too precise to be a prank. Frank Harrow was supposed to be buried in 2019. And yet he had played tag with Emily just 2 days ago. Michael kept the file from Sarah for now. Something about it felt too big, too wild, like sharing it would make it real. The next morning, he took a drive, past Willow Creek Park, past St. Mary's, to a place he hadn't visited in a decade, the Hall of Records. The woman at the counter wore half-moon glasses and a knowing smile. She found the name in seconds. Yes, Franklin D. Harrow. Pronounced dead after a hit-and-run just outside Richmond. No known relatives. Body released to county burial services. Michael's mouth was dry. What if he's still alive? The woman raised an eyebrow. Sir, if he's walking around, someone buried the wrong man. Either that, or someone lied. Back home, Frank was helping Emily build a lemonade stand. He looked normal. Happy. Not like a man with ghosts behind his eyes. Michael watched from the porch. Every instinct screamed that something was off, but then Frank laughed when Emily spilled sugar everywhere, and that laugh, it wasn't fake. It wasn't rehearsed. It was the laugh of someone alive. That night, Michael confronted him. Frank didn't deny the name. He didn't even flinch when Michael held up the photo. He sat down slowly, sighed deep like a man letting go of something heavy, and said, "You weren't supposed to find that." Then he told the story. His real name wasn't Frank Harrow. It was Jonathan Franklin Dell. He'd been in witness protection. Back in 2018, he'd been the accountant for a medical conglomerate called Artisan Health, a company involved in shady clinical trials and illegal patient dumping. When he tried to expose them, they made him disappear. Only the plan didn't work. The FBI staged his death. The blood, the hospital records, the burial, all fake, all designed to keep the wolves from sniffing. He was relocated, told to keep his head down, and promised a new identity. But then Artisan folded, the agents moved on, and the protection ended with no warning. No job. No money. Just a name and a street corner. For 5 years, he lived like a ghost. Until Emily's sandwich reminded him that he was still human. Michael felt like the walls were closing in. He wasn't angry, he'd seen stranger things in war, but he was worried. Because if someone had left that file on their doorstep, someone knew. And that someone might not want Jonathan alive. Frank, Jonathan, looked Michael in the eyes and said, "I'm not going to run again. Not now. Not after her. Emily." She had saved him in more ways than she could ever understand. Meanwhile, Sarah had her own moment of dread. That same day, while cleaning the garage, she found something tucked under a stack of old winter coats, a Polaroid. It wasn't theirs. It showed Emily on the swing at Willow Creek Park, time-stamped from last week. The angle wasn't from the sidewalk. It was from the trees. Michael called Officer Mendoza immediately. The man's voice, always calm, now carried the weight of someone who had just seen a storm on the radar. "Mr. Bennett, I need you to come down to the station. Alone. Tonight." That night, in the back room of the precinct, Mendoza finally told the truth. He knew Jonathan Dell. Knew the case. Knew that not everyone had been happy when Artisan fell. One former executive, Vincent Cale, had vanished right after the collapse. And now, there were whispers that someone had spotted Cale in Springfield Heights. Worse still. Cale had once called Jonathan Dell his protégé. Michael went home and barely slept. Emily was safe. The doors were locked. But his gut said this wasn't over. Then, just before dawn, the doorbell rang. A small package sat on their porch. Inside was a toy soldier, a cheap, plastic thing. Taped to it was a note. "Welcome back, Frankie. We've missed you." It took less than 30 seconds for Michael to know the toy soldier wasn't just a message, it was a declaration of war. He'd seen things like this before, back when he worked with security detail in Kandahar, back when messages weren't spoken but carved into the moments between silence. The note, folded twice and taped to the soldier's back, was written in typewriter ink, and the paper smelled faintly of tobacco and old engine oil, two things Michael had smelled often in his former life, both of which told him this man was old school. He didn't tell Sarah. He didn't want to scare Emily. But that morning, before sunrise, he walked to the shed and unlocked the black trunk at the very bottom, opened only once since his last tour. Inside were his tools, his notebooks, and one very old contact book, worn soft with use, pages smudged with sweat and desert sand. He made a single call. The man who picked up had no name, just a number, and a voice that sounded like gravel being dragged across cement. "You still breathing?" the voice said. Michael didn't answer the question. He simply said, "It's Dell. He's back. And so is Cale." The line went quiet for a long time. Then the voice said, "I'll come to you." 3 days passed. Frank, Jonathan, was different now. Not colder, not angry, but sharper, like something dormant inside him had stirred and now refused to sleep again. He helped Emily paint signs for her lemonade stand, but his eyes scanned the street every few minutes. He laughed when she danced, but never with both hands relaxed at his sides. Michael noticed. And Michael knew why. Somewhere out there, Cale was watching. And Cale didn't send plastic toys because he missed people. Cale sent warnings before storms. Sarah came to Michael that night with tears in her eyes and a folded piece of notebook paper in her hands. "I found this in Emily's backpack," she said. It wasn't a drawing. It was a copy of a classified form. A scanned page, cropped but real, showing Dell's name, aliases, and his former testimony against Artisan Health. Emily had no idea how it got there. She said a man at the park handed her an envelope and told her it was a puzzle from a friend of Uncle Frank. Michael's throat tightened. "Did he touch you?" he asked. She shook her head. But that was enough. He told Sarah everything, about the file, the old identity, the witness protection, the fake death, and Cale. The man from the phone call arrived the next day. He drove a battered Ford, wore a fishing cap and smelled like ash and pine. He called himself Reed, but Michael knew better than to believe that was true. He listened to the whole story in silence. When Michael finished, Reed lit a cigarette, blew smoke toward the ceiling, and said, "There's something you don't know. Something Dell never told you. They met Frank by the creek." Reed looked at him for a long time before speaking, like a man trying to remember a version of someone that no longer existed. Then he said, "Cale's not hunting you because of what you did. He's hunting you because of what you still have." Jonathan's face twisted. "What the hell does that mean?" Reed reached into his jacket and pulled out a flash drive, small, black, unmarked. "This is a ghost copy. Yours was the original. The one that never got decrypted. The one you were carrying the night the Bureau made you disappear." Frank blinked. "I lost that drive. I thought it was gone forever." Reed didn't blink. "Cale thinks you didn't. Cale thinks you kept a copy, somewhere private. Cale thinks the drive was just the bait." Frank stood silent, heart thudding. Then Michael asked the question none of them wanted to ask, "What's on it?" Reed looked up, and for the first time, his voice wavered. "Names. Hundreds of them. Doctors. Lawyers. Politicians. People who signed off on what Artisan did, on the patients who died, the money that vanished, and the cities they poisoned." He paused. "And one name you won't believe." They opened the ghost copy. Michael hooked it to his old military-grade laptop, the one with offline protocols and encryption shield so strong it would take the CIA 3 weeks to crack it. Frank watched as names began to fill the screen, line after line of dirty secrets dressed up in digital ink. And then the name appeared. Mendoza, Elias. Silence. A long, terrible silence. Michael stared at the name like it was a snake under glass. Officer Elias Mendoza, the man who had first come to their house, the man who had questioned Emily, the man who had sworn to protect them, was on the payroll of Artisan Health. And suddenly, everything made sense. The urgency. The silence. The lies. But then came the twist that none of them saw coming. Emily's school called. She hadn't shown up that morning. Sarah's face went white. Michael dropped the phone. On the counter was a note, written in that same typewriter ink. Let's not play hide and seek. You have something I need. Bring it to Willow Creek Park. Sunset. No threats. No violence. Just a place and a time. And no mention of the girl. But they knew. Emily was gone. Michael grabbed his pack. Frank grabbed the drive. And they both knew, Mendoza was never their friend. He was their enemy the whole damn time. But what none of them realized was this. Cale wasn't working alone. The sun was sinking fast, turning the edges of Willow Creek Park into a silhouette of twisted trees and dying gold. Michael and Frank stood at the trailhead, hearts drumming against their ribs like fists on a war drum, watching the shadows lengthen across the grass where Emily once played. In Frank's hand was the drive, warm from the tightness of his grip, shaking just slightly, like it knew what it carried. They hadn't told Sarah where they were going. They couldn't. It was the only way to keep her safe. At exactly 6 p.m., a black SUV rolled up like a panther in the dusk, smooth, quiet, coiled with menace. From the passenger seat stepped a man with gray temples, a perfect suit, and a look on his face like he'd just won a hand of poker in a burning casino. Vincent Cale. He smiled like the devil after confession. But the man who emerged behind him made the world tilt sideways. Emily. Untouched. Unharmed. Wrapped in a pink hoodie and holding a lollipop, looking confused but calm, because standing beside her, smiling gently like nothing was wrong at all, was Officer Mendoza. Michael felt the rage climb his chest like wildfire on dry timber. He stepped forward, fists clenched, but Cale raised a hand slowly, like a magician about to pull one final trick from a black top hat. No need for drama, Cale said, his voice smooth like oil on cold steel. Your daughter's safe. Safer than she's been, frankly, under your roof. We're only here for one thing. He nodded toward the flash drive. Frank didn't move. He didn't blink. Because something was wrong. Emily had always run to him. She always shouted, "Uncle Frank." But now, she didn't speak. She didn't smile. She looked distant. Like someone watching a movie they didn't quite understand. Cale stepped forward. You give us the drive, he said, voice low and deliberate, and we all go home with smiles and breathing lungs. You don't, and we all find out just how short life can be. Frank glanced at Michael. But then Mendoza, smiling, casual, calm, made a mistake. He said, you don't want Emily to see what happens when her heroes make bad choices. And just like that, everything changed. Michael's military brain kicked in. That wasn't fear in Mendoza's voice. That was arrogance. And arrogance has one fatal flaw, it never checks the rearview mirror. Because while Cale and Mendoza were focused on Frank, on the drive, on the old ghosts from a forgotten company, they forgot the one ghost that never died. The man they thought they'd buried 5 years ago. Frank Dell didn't raise his hands. He didn't beg. He simply said, Mendoza, how's your brother? The officer froze. Michael didn't understand. But Mendoza did. He stiffened, like a man remembering a door he should have locked. Frank kept going. Your brother. Alan Mendoza. The EMT. Worked the ambulance the night of my death. You told me he died in a fire 6 months later. Mendoza's jaw clenched. Frank stepped forward. He didn't die, did he? He disappeared. Just like I did. Silence. Cale stepped back, something unraveling in his carefully controlled face. Frank turned to Michael. There was a third man on the payroll. A cleaner. Someone inside the bureau who covered the tracks. Then, to Cale, you remember Agent Wexler, don't you? Cale's smile finally cracked. Wexler's dead. But Michael wasn't listening anymore. Because Emily had done something subtle, something small but screaming. She dropped her lollipop. And behind her, the man they thought was Mendoza stepped backward. Too far. Too calm. Frank saw it first. "That's not Mendoza," he whispered. "That's Wexler." The paradox snapped shut like a bear trap. The man who had protected them. The man who'd warned them. The man who had stood by Emily like a guardian angel. Was the same man who'd faked Frank's death, staged the body, and vanished 5 years ago. Agent Wexler, the Bureau's phantom, alive, untraceable, wearing the face of a dead cop. Mendoza had died. Wexler had become him. And Cale? Cale had been a pawn. Michael acted first. He lunged for Emily, using the old Marine shoulder drop, knocking her free from Wexler's grasp in one fluid, brutal motion. Frank hurled the flash drive across the field, just high enough, just far enough, straight into the duck pond. Cale screamed. Wexler pulled a gun. But the sound that came next wasn't a gunshot. It was a woman's voice. Sharp. Commanding. "FBI. Drop it now." Sarah. Holding Mendoza's old service pistol, hand steady, eyes blazing. Because Sarah had followed them. What happened next unraveled fast. Wexler tried to run. Cale tried to reach the pond. Michael tackled one. Reed appeared from the shadows like a forgotten god and dropped the other with a dart to the neck. By the time the backup arrived, real backup, summoned by Sarah's anonymous tip-line message, the ghosts had all been cornered. Every secret was laid bare. Frank sat in the back of the ambulance with Emily on his lap. She held his hand, didn't cry, didn't speak, just looked up and asked, "Uncle Frank, why did that man pretend to be your friend?" Frank didn't answer. But he cried. Not because of what had happened. But because of what he almost lost. Later, in the hospital room, something miraculous unfolded. Michael was reading the final FBI report. That's when a nurse came in and asked to see Mr. Harrow. "Frank Dell," Michael corrected. The nurse smiled. "No, sir. We're looking for Franklin Harrow." Michael frowned. "He died 5 years ago." The nurse shook her head, and then he walked in. Same face. Same beard. Same eyes. But older. Tired. Real. "My name's Frank Harrow," the man said softly. "I was in a coma. Woke up 6 months ago. Saw a news report about a homeless man using my name. I came to find out why." Frank Dell stared at the man for a long time. Then he whispered, "So I'm not Frank Harrow after all." "No," said the man gently. "But you saved my name. And I think I'd like to share it with you." In Springfield Heights, when the sun rose the morning after, it rose quietly, no sirens, no headlines, no neighborhood gossip louder than a whisper. But for the Bennett family, and for the man once called Frank, everything beneath that soft pink sky had shifted in a way that could never be undone. Michael stood in the doorway of Emily's room and watched her sleep, her arms wrapped tight around a stuffed rabbit with one torn ear, the same one she'd clung to in the ambulance the night before. His daughter had seen too much, but somehow hadn't broken. It reminded him of the soldiers he once knew, the kind who walked back from hell carrying invisible wounds but still managed to smile at the sunrise. Downstairs, Frank Dell, no longer hiding, no longer pretending, sat at the kitchen table with the real Frank Harrow, the man whose name he had carried like a borrowed coat in a winter too long to survive. They talked without bitterness, without blame, like two old men comparing scars from battles neither of them had chosen but both had endured. "I should be angry," Harrow had said, stirring his coffee with a spoon that clicked against the mug like a ticking clock. "But when I saw how Emily looked at you, I knew no one else ever taught her to believe in kindness." Sarah placed her hand gently on Frank Dell's shoulder, the man who had once only been a stranger on a bench. "You saved more than yourself," she said, her voice trembling just enough to be real, "you saved us." The days that followed passed in the quiet way redemption often comes, without fanfare, without trophies, just slow healing in shared breakfasts and memories being rebuilt one truthful word at a time. The FBI cleared Frank Dell of wrongdoing and confirmed the corruption buried deep within the bureau had finally been exposed, dragged into the light like rot beneath floorboards long hidden by pride. Mendoza's death was confirmed, his real death, not the illusion worn like a mask by Wexler. The man who'd impersonated a friend had been extradited, indicted, and stripped of every badge he had ever used to manipulate the people who trusted him most. Cale had disappeared during the chaos, slipping into the dark like a man born from shadow, leaving behind only a single fingerprint on a park bench and a cold file marked fugitive at large. No one spoke his name in the Bennett household anymore, not from fear, but because it no longer held power over their hearts. But then, just when peace had finally settled like dust on an undisturbed shelf, life pulled a final trick from its sleeve. It happened on a Thursday, the kind of slow afternoon where nothing seemed remarkable, until Emily came bursting through the door holding a school flyer in her hand. "They picked Uncle Frank," she shouted, face glowing. "He's going to be the guest speaker at our Heroes from the Community assembly." Frank Dell blinked. The word hero still felt like a shirt 3 sizes too big. Michael looked at him and said, "Guess it's about time you wore something that fits." At the assembly, Frank stood behind the podium, hands trembling, throat dry, staring at the sea of children in mismatched shoes and bright-colored shirts. He didn't speak right away. Then he began. "I once thought kindness was a currency I couldn't afford. That giving something meant losing something, and that people like me weren't meant to be remembered." He paused. The room was silent, waiting, hanging on every breath like it might fall. "But a little girl shared her sandwich with me. And because of that, I didn't just survive. I became someone worth remembering." The applause wasn't loud. It was thunderous. Back at the Bennett home, later that evening, Michael pulled an old envelope from the drawer, sealed, aged, yellowed with time. He handed it to Frank and said, "I found this after the night at the park. Thought maybe it wasn't time yet." Inside was a photo, one taken long ago, back before Artisan, back before the pain. It showed Frank in a lab coat, standing beside a smiling woman with dark eyes and a name tag that read Dr. Eliza Dell. His wife. Michael said, "She died thinking you were dead too. But she'd be proud of who you became." "I am." Frank said nothing. But the tears came anyway. The story could have ended there. It almost did. But life doesn't write in straight lines. Months later, on the anniversary of the day Emily gave away her sandwich, Michael received a call from the police department. He was invited to attend a ceremony, an award, they said, for outstanding civilian contribution to community safety and welfare. He almost declined. But Sarah said, "You've carried this family like a soldier. Maybe it's time someone carried your story." And so they went. At the ceremony, they shook hands with officers, sat through long speeches, and smiled for photos. But then, just as they were leaving, a man stepped out from behind the crowd, older now, thinner, with a scar above his eyebrow. "Cale." Michael froze. But the man raised both hands, showed he was unarmed, and simply said, "I came to see it for myself. I came to see what I lost." He didn't try to run. Didn't threaten. Just faded back into the crowd. Michael never saw him again. Frank eventually moved out. Not far, just 4 houses down. He rented a small place, fixed up the porch, and built a swing for Emily to use when she visited every Saturday. They called it Uncle's Corner. He never stopped watching the bench in Willow Creek Park. He just didn't sit on it anymore. Because some places are graves. Others are gardens. Epilogue, the reversal ending. 1 year later, on a chilly April morning, Frank Dell stood by Emily's piano recital, watching her play with fingers too small for the beauty they carried. Michael sat beside him, proud and quiet. Sarah held his hand. The 3 of them, bound not by blood, but by something older, something deeper. And then a small, familiar hand slipped into Frank's. He looked down. Emily smiled. "I wrote a song," she whispered. "It's called The Man Who Wasn't Dead." Frank laughed. And for the first time in years, it didn't feel like a sound borrowed from someone else's throat. It felt like it belonged to him. Write in the comments where you're from. Let's see how far these stories can spread. And of course, subscribe so you don't miss new exciting stories. See you soon.